Hello everyone and welcome to Religion Reconsidered. Firstly, I want to thank my good friend David Bliss, the remarkable talent behind Labot, who wrote, played and recorded our new theme music. So I hope you all enjoyed that and go and check him out on Spotify. Now we are doing another series on the show, and this time we're looking at the desert mothers and fathers, and more generally the Coptic Christian Church. So for this series, I went and spent 4 days at the monastery of St. Macarius, which is situated in the Nitrian Desert northwest of Cairo. So my time at the monastery will be dealt with in the next episode, but today we are looking specifically at the desert mothers and fathers, where they came from, who they were, and what they got up to. So for a top-level summary, the desert mothers and fathers were a group of monks who lived primarily in the Egyptian desert from the 3rd century onwards. They were the originators of monastic life in Christianity, and their lives have come down to us by what are known as the sayings of the desert mothers and fathers, which is a collection of their teachings that were recorded during the 4th century. So Paul of Thebes was the first person to head into the Egyptian desert, where he came to live the life of a Christian ascetic, and then he was soon followed by Anthony the Great, Saint Anthony, who is the most famous of the Desert Fathers and really the one who started the whole thing as a mass movement. And they were both kicking around towards the end of the 3rd century. But before diving in, there's probably 2 contextual things worth looking at in regard to the time just before Paul went into the wilderness. And as with all worthwhile conversation, they are politics and religion. So firstly and briefly, there is the political context with Rome, the dominant empire of the region, going through what's called the crisis of the 3rd century. This was a period of intense upheaval, military anarchy, and a constant overturning of the emperors in Rome. If you read on Wikipedia, that great source of all knowledge, it's sort of funny because it has the length of time that emperors were in power. And during this period, it states 1 month, 2 months, 1 year, less than a month. And then there's poor old Emperor Sabanicus, where it just says, very briefly. And on top of this, there is war with the Sasanian Persians to the east and the Gauls to the north, a constant migration of people around the empire, the Cyprian plague, and peasant rebellions. So a tumultuous time, to say the least. Now, looking at the religious context, Christianity was still a burgeoning religion at the time, but it had definitely found a foothold across the Mediterranean world and was beginning to become problematic for the Roman emperors, who were concerned about its development and the threat that it would pose to the state-sponsored religion. As such, Rome began to institute empire-wide persecutions of Christians, perhaps the most well-known being the persecutions of Emperor Decius, Valerian, and Diocletian. Now, I'm sure the emperors at the time would have thought it odd, but the reaction of a lot of the Christians to these persecutions was almost spiritual jubilation, as it was seen that martyrdom, or being killed for being a Christian, was the best way that one could die and would ensure a spot in the heavenly hereafter. So you had Christians going out and seeking death by the authorities. For one anecdote, Origen of Alexandria sought the end brought through martyrdom, as his father had done. However, his mother, cleverly, hid his clothes, and so the naked Origen was restrained from running out to proclaim his faith. Speaking of Origen, beyond the persecutions of Christians, this was a great time of theological debate and deliberation for the developing religion, as scholars considered what the coming of this person, Jesus of Nazareth, really meant. Who was he? What was his message, and how did he fit within the existing understandings of the world, particularly that of the Greek philosophers? So you have figures such as Origen, Tertullian, and Irenaeus writing on these incredible questions and coming up with some of the doctrinal answers for the first time. There would be many a podcast required to go through these works and this period of development in detail, so we'll definitely leave that perhaps for another time. But it was roughly about the year 250 AD, during the period of the persecutions of Decius and Valerian, that a well-off and educated 16-year-old Paul fled into the Theban desert on the western edge of the Red Sea. Now, Paul wasn't fleeing from Roman persecutions, but was rather hiding from his brother-in-law, who intended to kill him in order to steal his inheritance. In the desert mountains, Paul found a cave with a nearby stream and a covering palm tree, providing a site that fulfilled the bottom 2 rungs of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. While the information surrounding his life is scant, it is at least clear that when Paul went out into the desert, he never intended to spend his life in the wilderness, but simply went to wait out the Roman persecutions and the greed of his brother-in-law. Furthermore, there is no information about how or why Paul decided to stay and how he went from hiding from outside the world to never intending to return. Nevertheless, Paul became a spiritual hermit and lived out his days in the wilderness, largely unknown and unseen, but nevertheless tempted. The biography of Paul is then picked up on the day of his death, when he receives a visit from a person who has turned Paul's way of life into a burgeoning community and an example to be followed. And that is St. Anthony the Great. The origins of St. Anthony's life as a recluse share some similarities to that of Paul. Firstly, they were both relatively wealthy, and their parents similarly died while they were at a young age, with Anthony being about 18 at the time of his parents' death. In the story of his life, it is said that Anthony was more generally concerned with things beyond the material world, and so it was a mere 6 months after his parents' death, where he went to church and heard the words of chapter 19 of St. Matthew's Gospel. "If you would be perfect, go, sell what you possess and give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me." So, as any rash youth from the 3rd century Egypt might do, Anthony followed the words of Jesus in the Gospel, sold his possessions, and began to live a life of poverty and discovery of God. After 15 years or so, and trials of being tempted by demons and having experiences of God, Anthony decided it was time to take a further step into renunciation of the world, and headed into the desert. Now, the desert in Christianity has always been a place of great mystical importance. Following freeing the Israelites from Pharaoh, Moses and his followers spent 40 years walking through the desert in search of the Promised Land. John the Baptist was living in the desert on locusts and wild honey and preaching the coming of Jesus. And then following his baptism, Jesus is led into the desert where he spends 40 days being tempted by the devil. Beyond this, in the broader culture of Egypt at the time, the desert was considered an uninhabitable realm where evil spirits lived that was beyond the ability of normal people to survive. So destitute and barren, those that dared venture into the wilderness were not to return. So Anthony heading into the desert held symbolic spiritual significance, but also showed a great trust in God and his developing practice. News of Anthony's hermitage spread throughout the area, and people from far and wide came to sit at his cave and learn from him. However, it was only after a period of about 20 years that he eventually emerged. Those waiting for his emergence reported that miraculously, Anthony's body remained unchanged from how he had entered his seclusion, and expressed a radiance where it was clear that he had been initiated into the divine mysteries and inspired by God. Anthony took on followers, and so the first monastic settlement was established on Mount Pisgah, with Anthony as the father, the Abba. To come full circle on Paul, when Anthony was 90, he was visited by an angel who told him that there was another hermit, holier than he, living in the desert, and that he was to go and visit him. So, true to form, Anthony ventured directionless into the desert and was shown the way to Paul's cave by a hippo centaur with the upper body of a man and the lower body of a horse. On finding Paul's cave, the two met, and Paul informed Anthony that the reason for his visit was so that he would bury him. Paul died that day, and Anthony, with a newfound piety, lay the old hermit to rest. Monasticism throughout Syria, Palestine, and particularly Egypt spread, and there was a focus on the Christian way of prayer combined with monastic elements of fasting, celibacy, solitude, and silence. Then, when Christianity became accepted throughout the Roman Empire by Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313, devout Christians began to see a malaise set in that quelled the fervour of the followers. There was no longer the opportunity for martyrdom, and so the ultimate method of proving one's faith and achieving salvation was gone. Instead of physically dying through martyrdom, the idea developed that by leaving the material world, abandoning society, and seeking a life of austerity, one could die from the world, renouncing all and achieving a new life in Christ. For many, they only saw one way to do that, and it was to venture into the desert. The people that took up this style of life were not priests or bishops, but rather lay people who considered themselves in the depths of sin and in the greatest need of salvation. Their vows were made between themselves and God. As such, in opposition to the church fathers who we mentioned earlier, the desert mothers and fathers were focused on living the experiential life of prayer and coming closer to God. Not that the church fathers weren't doing so, but what has come down from importance has been a real focus on the desert fathers of their prayerful life. They did not spend their days debating theological discourse or in deep ponderance of the nature of God, although there are stories of Anthony going to Alexandria and debating there with the Arians, but the overwhelming focus on the hermitic life was on personal prayer. As one of the sayings goes, go and sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything. And just on a point of verbiage, the fact that where the hermits lived was referred to as cells, I think says a lot about how they viewed their way of life. But it was the simplicity that was the hallmark. They would either build huts or take shelter in caves near water sources, sometimes setting up within relative proximity to one another. In particular, as was the case with Anthony and a number of other notable fathers, people would come to live near an elder hermit to receive guidance on their newfound way of life. They would weave ropes or baskets from the leaves of date palms, and this would provide enough money for their subsistence, but any thought of owning property beyond this was illogical. As Hipparichius said, to adopt poverty freely is the monk's treasure. Within their simplicity, there was no doubt a level of severe austerity, and some of the sayings are quite intense. So to give a few examples, they said of Agatho that for 3 years he kept a stone in his mouth in order to teach himself silence. Or Arsenius, who said 1 hour's sleep is enough for a monk if he is a fighter. Or another where it was said of Hiladius that he lived 20 years in his cell and did not once raise his eyes to the roof. And in the desert, the severity of life is obvious. It is hot and dry with little food and water. So that basic aspect of their life was without comforts. But within this severity, there is an aspect of compassion and realism. And another story of the life of St. Anthony shows this. So, reading from the book and the chapter on discretion. A hunter happened to come by and saw Anthony talking in a relaxed way with his brothers, and he was shocked. The hermit wanted to show him how we should sometimes be less austere for the sake of the brothers, and said to him, "Put an arrow in your bow and draw it." He did so, and Anthony said, "Draw it further," and he drew it further. He said again, "Draw it yet further," and he drew it some more. Then the hunter said to him, "If I draw it too far, the bow will snap." Anthony answered, "So it is with God's work. If we always go to excess, the brothers quickly become exhausted. It is sometimes best not to be rigid." The hunter was ashamed when he heard this, and profited much from it. And Poman, another desert father, was asked how he dealt with any brother who fell asleep during public prayer, to which he replied, "I put his head upon my knees and help him to rest." Or in the simple words of Arsenius, each should do what is right for his own way of life. There is a clear similarity here between what the monks learned in their discretion and perseverance and what the Buddha learned through the middle path. For when the Buddha was developing his systematic meditation, one of the things he tried was extreme fasting. And after this extreme austerity, the Buddha learned that it was not a sustainable method through which one can progress. So learned the monks. As Anthony said, some wear out their bodies by fasting, but because they have no discretion, this puts them further away from God. Now, to look specifically at the sayings, it is a compendium of small snippets of anecdotes and teachings that are organized into chapters, each having its own theme. So, in amongst the others, there is a chapter on quiet, a chapter on lust, a chapter on fortitude, hospitality, obedience, but above all, there is the chapter on humility, which was considered the greatest attribute that the hermits strove for. This was the reason they wouldn't become priests or bishops, and why they were very reluctant to see visitors, let alone take on pupils. Pride, above all, was the greatest sin that the hermits were to guard against. And there is one story that really encapsulates this. So, returning again to the book. The devil appeared to a monk disguised as an angel of light, and said to him, "I am the angel Gabriel, and I have been sent to you." But the monk said, "Are you sure you weren't sent to someone else? I'm not worthy to have an angel sent to me." At that, the devil vanished. One of the things that I found fascinating while reading about the sayings of the desert mothers and fathers that I found in this passage is the very real way that they relate to both angels and demons. Indeed, following the life of St. Anthony, the core of the hermit's life is about battling demons and overcoming temptation. In one of the stories regarding Anthony, he was physically beaten up by demons, but for the most part, it is the internal battles that one must fight that were the most prominent. Again, in the words of Anthony, he who sits alone and is quiet has escaped from 3 wars: hearing, speaking, and seeing. But there is one thing against which he must continually fight, and that is his own heart. As it was, this gave a real importance to Psalm 27. Though an army should array itself against me, my heart will not be afraid. But in the sayings, the visitations of tempting demons are a constant theme, which gives the internal battles being waged within the human hearts of the hermits an existential edge. In modern religious parlance, talk of demons generally gets short shrift. So it was rather confronting to have it be such a central part of the readings and expressed in such a lively way, but also gave me at least a new appreciation of the battles that were being fought. Now, monastic life has been central to both Western and Eastern Christianity, but it has its roots in the ways of the desert life. The founder of the great early monastic centre in Jerusalem, Melania the Elder, is said to have visited the monks in Egypt to learn of their ways, as well as Jerome and Paula, who established a double monastery in Bethlehem after visiting the monks. Also, the rule of St. Benedict, written in the early 6th century, some would call the cornerstone of Western monasticism, makes specific reference to the sayings of the desert mothers and fathers. Yet, while the seeds were sprouting in the monasticism of the West, as Berber raids became more and more common throughout North Africa in the 5th century, the great communities of monks and hermits living in the Egyptian desert were uprooted. But we will touch more on that in our next episode. Beyond monasticism, the influence of the desert mothers and fathers is greatly understated. We mentioned earlier that the monks had considered pride the greatest of the sins against which war must be waged, but it was actually they who came up with the initial classification of what is now known as the 7 deadly sins. Evagrius Ponticus, an Egyptian monk, developed what he called the 8 evil thoughts, which were classified as gluttony, lust, greed, sadness, anger, sloth, vainglory, and pride. Obviously, these have been a hallmark of Christian moral teaching throughout the world, but it was in the quiet of the cell in the Egyptian desert where people first contended with these specific formidable foes. There is one last anecdote that indicates the awe that people have held for the desert mothers and fathers, and how the simple yet powerful act of living a prayerful and ascetic life could inspire people across the seas. In 386, a highly educated yet troubled young and future St. Augustine was in his private garden in Milan, when suddenly some visitors arrived and described how 2 of their friends had left their prominent and important jobs in the imperial civil service and relinquished themselves from the world after hearing of the life of St. Anthony of Egypt. St. Augustine then writes, "I flung myself down under a fig tree, how I know not, and gave free course to my tears. I was saying these things and weeping in the most bitter contrition of my heart, when suddenly I heard the voice of a boy or a girl, I know not which, coming from the neighbouring house, chanting over and over again, 'Pick it up, read it. Pick it up, read it.' Immediately I ceased weeping, and began most earnestly to think whether it was usual for children in some kind of game to sing such a song, but I could not remember ever having heard the like. So, damning the tone of my tears, I got to my feet, for I could not but think that this was a divine command to open the Bible and read the first passage I should light upon. For I had heard how Anthony, accidentally coming into church while the gospel was being read, received the admonition as if it was being addressed to him, 'Go and sell what you have and give it to the poor, and you shall have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me.' Here we see how the example of simple silence, austerity, and prayer became the pivotal movement that changed the heart of history's most influential Christian theologian. For those interested, on Instagram this week, I've been doing some readings from the sayings of the desert mothers and fathers and going through some of the chapters. I think the sayings really bring to life what the monks were aiming towards and guarding against, and I would recommend grabbing a copy of the sayings if you're interested. As I said, this episode is part of a series on the desert mothers and fathers, and so in our next episode, we are traveling to Egypt, to the Nitrian desert and the monastery of St. Macarius, to see the life of the monks that continued to live the life of the desert fathers. That'll be a special episode, so please press that subscribe button wherever it is to make sure you don't miss it when it comes out. But for now, we've got some great outro music, which no doubt you'll all enjoy, and as always, thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed the podcast.